Thank you, Professor. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Good morning, everyone. I would like, first of all, to acknowledge that we are really happy and honored to be here today. And we owe special thanks to the organizing committee for settling this rich seminar. So as you can tell, our study investigates the effects of cultural leadership on organizational identification, which is prepared by Mr. Zakaria El Hilali and I. As you can tell, we have two main concepts: cultural leadership and organizational identification. The outline of our presentation is as follows. We'll start by an introduction. We will review the literature and we will see the methodology adopted for this study, the findings, and last but not least, interpretation and limitation, along with a conclusion. So the scholar James MacGregor Burns, who is attributed with founding contemporary leadership studies, argues that the concept of leadership is one of the most observed and least understood phenomena on Earth. There are actually plenty of theory and research that has been devoted to this study of leadership, of course. Historians, philosophers, and social scientists have attempted to understand and figure out this concept for centuries. Every organization has, be it a company or a nation or political party, has leadership. So it seems that every group of people must have a leadership that guides and unifies its direction. So there are thousands of books and articles that have been written about the concept of leadership. So if you just type the word leadership on Google search bar, you will find thousands of definitions. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of definitions of this term, but however, for the purpose of our study, we have adopted this following definition. So leadership is a dynamic, interactive working relationship between a leader and one or more followers operating within the framework of a group context for the accomplishment of some collective goal. So the words highlighted here, we have dynamic, interactive, working relationship, and collective goal. All of them are omnipresent in order to realize a unified aim of that factory or organization. So there is a lot of theory that were developed to better understand this concept of leadership. We have the LMX theory, the leader-member exchange theory, authentic, charismatic, participative, and along with others to better understand this concept. But however, we have adopted this theory or approach, which is the cultural leadership. So basically, this cultural leadership asserts that effective leaders concern themselves with much more than managing and supervising everyday tasks or motivating employees to complete these tasks or reach anticipated goals. Instead, these leaders are attentive to the assumptions and values that create and reflect organizational culture. But before digging into the cultural leadership, we shall better understand what is an organizational culture. So it can be regarded as an organization personality. A culture is to a group what personality or character is to an individual. And there are many factors that impact organizational culture. We have the sector in which the organization operates, its geographic locations. For instance, how a factory or an organization operates in Morocco is not the same, for instance, in the United States. The events that took place during its history, personalities, and its employees, the macro context whereby it is exhibited in the national, ethnic, and religious culture, and the functional tasks and occupations. So when we talk about the concept of leadership, we automatically think of the organizational culture. Here, leaders provide the beliefs and values that get a group moving in dealing with its internal and external problems. So it can be said that an organization is like a family, and the children often imitate the behaviors of their parents and absorb those values and beliefs of their parents. So cultural leadership is basically constituted thanks to the interconnectedness between organizational culture and leadership. Before, the cultural leadership here influences the ideologies, beliefs, values, and norms that members of organizations share, and the cultural forms through which they are expressed. So leaders here influence and manage the culture of their organizations. But how? This is what Edgar Schein has tried to answer, and he came up with some embedding mechanisms as an answer, whereby we have the primary mechanism and the secondary mechanism. What's wrong with that? So the primary mechanisms are exhibited in the things that a leader pays attention to, measures, and controls on a regular basis, how leaders react in a critical incident or a crisis. As for the secondary mechanism, they involve stories about important events and people or formal statements of organizational philosophy, creeds, and charters. Now we move on to the second main concept, which is the organizational identification. It is basically a concept that is based on Tashfield's social identity theory, which is that part of an individual's self-concept that derives from his knowledge or his or her membership of a social group. So basically, organizational identification is the perception of oneness with or belongingness to a group involving direct or indirect experience of its achievements and failures. So here, the identification with an organization can be compared with identifying with the football team, for instance. If we take the football team of Barcelona, if this, for instance, don't blame me, Madridians. So if a football team, Barcelona, wins, the person or that individual who identifies himself with that team, he will experience that win or that loss, depending on the situation. So to conclude, there are many studies that have tried to study the relationship between leadership and organizational identifications, as you can tell. But however, very few included the cultural approach to leadership in their studies, and that's what our study tries to do. So I will give the floor to my mate Zakaria to tackle the practical parts.
Okay, thank you, Sana. So I will start with the research hypothesis. So as was mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, our study tried to understand or explain the relationship between cultural leadership and organizational identification. So I'm going to read a quote from an article by Q and Zhao. So cultural leadership is supposed to influence employees' attitudes towards or toward organizational culture, which includes the mission, vision, and values of the organization. On the other hand, organizational identification is reflected in the internalization of the organization's values and norms. So as we can see here, there is a conceptual link between the two concepts, and this is what we try to put into practice. So we hypothesize the following. There is a positive relationship between cultural leadership and organizational identification. In other words, or in simpler terms, leaders who demonstrate higher levels of cultural leadership. As you know, leadership is not anything, it's actions, it's behaviors. So will increase their followers' level of organizational identification. To test our hypothesis, we adopted a quantitative approach, particularly we adopted a correlational design. And this type of design examines the relationship between variables without controlling or manipulating any of them. Correlation might be positive or negative, and it indicates the strength and or direction of the relationship between the two variables. And just to remind you, our variables are cultural leadership, which is the independent variable, and the outcome variable is the organizational identification. Okay, as for the research instruments we used, or to measure the two variables, we designed a questionnaire which consisted of three main sections. The first was devoted to collecting personal information, and the second was the CLS, or the cultural leadership scale, and the third was the organizational identification scale. After that, we translated the questionnaire into French. Just to give you an idea about what the scale is, so it was developed and validated by Q, Zhao, and Few. This scale measures the degree to which individuals in leadership positions engage in these five types of leadership behaviors. The other scale is the organizational identification scale, just a 6-item scale developed by Edwards and Peachy. So just to give you an idea what the questionnaire looked like, so it looked like this. So the employee rates their leadership by agreeing or disagreeing with a set of statements. I present to you a list or a set of examples. The other scale, organizational identification, is the same. So you rate your agreement with the sets or exactly 6 items. Okay, so the cultural leadership scale consists of 26 items or statements. There are leadership behaviors, and the employee has to agree or disagree with the statements. And this questionnaire or the level of cultural leadership will range from 26 to 130. So the higher the score, the higher the level of cultural leadership of the leader. And the other ranges between or from 6 to 36. So the higher the score, the higher the level of organizational identification of the employee. As for the participants of the study, so they were employees from or at 3 different organizations in Oujda and 1 in Casablanca, Coca-Cola, Colemu, and OFPPT Central in Casablanca. As for the procedures, normal procedures, we contacted the HR of both organizations, asked for their permission, etc. I'm not going to waste time on this. As for the results, so I'm going to give you a summary of the results. So 75 participants filled in the questionnaire, but there was a very low level of participation among 20 questionnaires that were distributed. Only 54 responded, in addition to the 21 participants who filled the online questionnaire. So this is the gender and the age of the participants. So you can move on. So as to test our hypothesis, we adopted the person-product moment correlation coefficients, and we used the SPSS to assess the relationship or the correlation between the level of organization of cultural leadership and that of organizational identification. So after running the test, results showed that there is a moderate positive correlation between the 2 variables. So R equals 0.311. So to give you an idea, can you move on to the next slide? To give you an idea of what this person correlation coefficient, so its value ranges between -1 and 1. If it's 0, there is no relationship or correlation between the 2 variables in question. If it's -0, means there is a negative relationship. If it's above 0, that means there is a positive relationship between the 2 variables studied. It could be strong, moderate, or weak. And we found, could you move back? We found that there is a relationship or a correlation, but it was moderate. Now let's move on to interpretation and discussion. So the results obtained confirmed our hypothesis. There is indeed a positive relationship between cultural leadership and organizational identification. As to save some time, I'm going directly to some recommendations. So managers and directors should focus more on the cultural, not just the mechanical aspect of their organization, being an effective leader implies behaving in a manner that takes into consideration the cultural aspect of organizations, because an organization is not just a building, it's more of a culture, an atmosphere, a climate, as well as the importance of values and beliefs for employees as they help increase employees' organizational identification. So managers should also focus on the importance of communicating in a way that raises the level of organizational identification of their employees. As an organization is like a brand, or managers should view their organizations as brands. So the more you identify with your organization, or the more an employee identifies with his or her organization, the more loyal you are to it. As for the limitations I mentioned before, there was a very low level of participation. So in the future, we're going to try to broaden the population, more cities from more organizations from different cities, and we're going to try to target different types of organizations, public, semi-public, and also private. At the end, I would like to leave you with this nice quote by Edgar Schein, who is one of the most influential scholars in the field of organizational culture. So he says that one could argue that the only thing of real importance that leaders do is to create and manage culture, and that the unique talent of leaders is their ability to understand and work with culture.